Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming out. I am looking at the audience and seeing some implacable fighters for the closure of Guantanamo, including one who was down in Washington with us this week when we were protesting, others who have written and studied and reported on, and other people who have taken stands about Guantanamo. But I'm not assuming everybody knows all about Guantanamo. I know I don't. I've studied it as much as I can, but I thought it would be important to convey a few key things about how completely illegitimate what the U.S. has done in setting up Guantanamo really is. And it's important to do this. The mission of World Can't Wait is to stop the crimes of our government. And a couple of ways we go at that are to really hammer from every angle on what is illegitimate about what this government is doing, and also to bring a real sense of internationalism and what that means. American lives are not more important than other people's lives. And with that taken as the background, let me just remind you that 14 years ago this week, the Bush regime set up, basically in a field on the base at Guantanamo in Cuba, some cages. And they brought, I think it was maybe 80 people who had been gathered up, supposedly from the battlefield in Afghanistan. And they kept them in cages for months. And they brought them under just horrific conditions of being blindfolded, tied up, put in diapers, not allowed to speak, completely ignorant of where they were going. It would be as if, Al-Qaeda took you and bound you up and threw you into a jail for a few months and tortured you and then took you somewhere else and said, oh, you're going to be here forever. This is what the United States really did. And what did it represent? It represented something deeply in opposition to accepted international law. Why did they even put the men in Guantanamo? It was because they were trying to get away from U.S. law, where, under habeas corpus, we are not supposed to be allowed to be kept forever and never charged and not tried. This is very basic to what the United States says it stands for around the world. And I think the fact that Guantanamo was so much in the face of this and has become an emblem and emblematic of the U.S. breaking with this, has really kept people very confused for a long time. But I've come to understand in really looking at it that the United States government actually wanted a place where they could hold people and say, look, there's not a damn thing you can do about it. Try going through our court system. All these people who finally won the right to habeas corpus at Guantanamo, many have had their habeas corpus petitions turned down. And what this means is that from the top of the government, they've been given a right to habeas corpus, but it's been very difficult to continue it. So you can read a great deal, and it is really worth doing so to understand the level of outright absolute torture, yes, that was developed in Guantanamo, then spread to Abu Ghraib, and spread into Iraq. You can understand that very few of these men were ever fighters against the United States. For the most part, the men picked up in Afghanistan and Pakistan were there as pilgrims, or they were working, and they happened to be sold to the U.S. government for $5,000 bounties. This is true. Now, most of the men by now have been released. There are, as of today, I think 93 left. About half of them are being told, or they're being described as prisoners who could never be released or charged. Why can't they be charged? The government says they don't have the evidence to charge them, but they also say that they are too dangerous to release. And we are supposed to think, these must be the worst of the worst people ever invented that are now not allowed to be released. But in fact, and I'm sure Andy will speak about this, many of these people the government knows very little about. So people were tortured, not the least of which that torture amounted to being told 10 years ago in some cases, you're going to be released. And then you're not. Your children grow up and move away. Your parents die. You never meet your children. They become teenagers and you don't know, you have no relationship with them. This is deep psychological pain and torture that people have been put through in some ways for nothing, but mostly in service to the need for the U.S. to dominate the world and to say that there are people, millions of people, who don't deserve any protection as human beings. And I guess that's what keeps us talking about this and digging further into it and demanding close Guantanamo now. We had protests in 14 places in the US and in London and in Mexico City and a few other places around the country this week. Much too little, and I appreciate Andy making the point that many people have forgotten about this, but we don't intend to forget about this, and it's important tonight, I think, for everyone to be very willing to raise your questions and give your thinking about what it's going to take to close this, which is the subject of tonight. I'm really excited to have Andy here. This is the 6th year World Can't Wait has brought him to this country for this anniversary, and he's been in all sorts of cities in addition to New York, and here he's spoken every year. Last year he came to talk to us about the campaign that he started to stand with shocker Aamer, who is the longest serving British resident in Guantanamo. And of course part of the story tonight is that it was a success. Shocker came home. Many, many people worked on it. Andy was one of the key figures in fighting to have this happen last October. And I think there's a lot to learn from the campaign, and there's much more to learn about what is it going to take to shut this place down. And again, keep in mind, completely illegitimate, immoral, unjust, nothing to do with a society that we would want to live in, where people would have the right to have charges against them and being able to defend themselves and have access to lawyers. Do you know that these, not only the prisoners, but their lawyers have a very restricted ability right now to even know what the government thinks these men did wrong. They have to go to a special lockdown building to read things. This is completely wrong, and it is completely in contradiction with what the U.S. says it represents around the world, and we have a whole lot to say about that. So Andy has written, as Andy Z said, the Guantanamo Files, the most definitive story of the 779 men who were locked up. He still follows this every day. He put out a wonderful film called Outside the Law, now 5 or 6, 7 years ago, right? And he's writing about this every day, and has also launched a new career as a political musician. And so maybe we're going to get to hear some of that tonight. So listen to what Andy has to say, and then really, really challenge you to think very deeply, and let's have a conversation about this. Andy.
you, Deborah. Thank you, Revolution Books. Yeah, it's great, as Deborah said, this is the 6th January that she's come over here. That's the great bit, is that Deborah helps me to come over here, not that I have to keep coming here because Guantanamo is open, because that's obviously not so great at all. I must have to just first of all say that it's always weird standing at a podium with a microphone when you study Guantanamo, because there was an infamous decision taken by Donald Rumsfeld about which torture techniques to apply at Guantanamo, one of which involved painful shackling and making prisoners stand, and he was told that he wasn't allowed to make prisoners stand, at which he scrawled on the memo, "I stand for 8 to 10 hours a day, what's wrong with these people at Guantanamo?" Because that was how Rumsfeld worked, was standing at a podium, which has always made me wary of podiums ever since. The campaign to free Shaka Aamer from Guantanamo was going on for as long as Guantanamo was open, essentially, as soon as people were able to find out who was in there. There were 9 British nationals held at Guantanamo and other British residents, and it was a long journey, obviously, to get any of those people out. The first British nationals were released in 2004, second batch in 2005. Tony Blair, the war criminal, then refused to advocate on behalf of the British residents. And it took a change of leader when Gordon Brown took over from Tony Blair in the summer of 2007 for that position to change. The British government then called for the release of the British residents. 3 of those men were released in December, one was released shortly after that, another 3 were released in December 2007. When President Obama became president, there were 2 British residents left in Guantanamo. One man, Binyan Mohammed, had been sent to Morocco to be tortured. His case had, through some clever manoeuvring by lawyers in the UK, gone through the courts where judges had been shocked to learn that their government was complicit in torture. And his case had caused such a scandal, crossing the Atlantic, lapping onto the shores of the United States, this scandal in the courts in the UK, that he was freed in February 2009, leaving just Shaka Aamer in Guantanamo. Now at that point, Shaka Aamer had been told by the Bush administration, actually in the fall of 2007, that they no longer wanted to hold him, and was then joining the rest of the prisoners under the new administration of President Obama in having his fate decided by a high-level interagency task force that President Obama established to review the cases of all the prisoners. There were 240 prisoners whose cases were reviewed, and the task force decided that 156 of these men could be released, that 36 would be prosecuted, and that 48 men would continue to be held indefinitely without charge or trial on the basis, as Deborah mentioned, that they were regarded as too dangerous to release, but the government acknowledged that insufficient evidence existed to put them on trial. Now, I don't think it takes much to think about that, to realize that if you have insufficient evidence to put someone in trial, you don't actually have evidence. It's not evidence. What it is, so what is it? Well, it's a collection of generally unreliable statements made by the prisoners themselves or made by their fellow prisoners when they were subjected to torture, when they were subjected to other forms of abuse. Some of them were bribed with better living conditions. Other people who have spoken about it have said that they were simply exhausted at the effort of resisting the interrogators demanding answers from them and pulling them out of their cells in the middle of the night and taking them to interrogation over and over again, and doing what they did, which was they showed them a photo album. They called it the family album. Photos of prisoners, some in Guantanamo, some in other places, some that they wanted to capture and demanding to know what they knew about them. And some of the men who'd been released, and this happened in many cases, said, you know, at some point I just couldn't do it anymore, so I just started saying yes. In fact, Jen, who is here tonight, Jen Fenton, spoke to a Kuwaiti man who said exactly that. she said, "Can I ask you about these allegations that you made?" And he said, "You can, but honestly, I have to tell you, I don't remember the things that I said. I just reached a point where I couldn't resist anymore, and I just said yes to everything." So this is the situation that Shaka found himself in as one of these men who was approved for release, but who then ended up not being released. And for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons was that a number of these men were from Yemen, and the Obama administration, like the Bush administration before, was extremely wary of releasing anyone to Yemen. Another reason was that there was opposition from Congress. So Congress started passing laws that imposed serious obstacles to President Obama's ability to easily release prisoners from Guantanamo. It must be said that when you hear the President and his people say that it's all to do with Congress, that's not strictly true. There has been a waiver in the legislation that has allowed him to bypass congressional obstacles if he wanted to, but he's chosen not to do. He has not wanted to spend the political capital having a fight with the Republicans and releasing prisoners when he could do it. In Shaka Aamer's case, we have to conclude that one of the reasons that there was such a delay in releasing him was because of the very nature of the man himself. This is a man who, it seems to me, pretty much everyone who has ever met him has described him as charismatic and eloquent. And I have met him, and he is very charismatic and eloquent. We didn't know really for years quite what was going on with him, because they weren't publicly revealing that actually they'd been having discussions for many years about whether they could get away with sending him back to the country of his birth, which is Saudi Arabia. Now, Shaka left Saudi Arabia as a young man. He came to the States, where he lived for many years. Then he moved to the UK, which was where he met his British wife. They had 4 kids, and then went to Afghanistan to engage in humanitarian aid projects, and Shaka was rounded up and sent to Guantanamo. So these discussions between the United States and Saudi Arabia, and at one point between the UK and Saudi Arabia as well, obviously indicated that for some time the US wanted to send him back to Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia being a regime that wasn't happy about the fact that Shaka had left home and was critical of the place, and it would have silenced him one way or another had he gone back there. We would not have been hearing publicly from him about what he had to say. And the primary thing I think about Shaka is that he is he's irrepressible, and they wanted to silence him because I don't think that he would have stopped talking otherwise. And I think what we've seen since he was released is that he can talk. Now the thing is, does Shaka know about things that are, that are of serious danger to the credibility of the United States? Does he know something that is so extraordinary that it's going to lead to senior Bush officials being hauled out of their beds and put on trial somewhere? Well, I think we can say that that's really not going to happen. The government here, as in the UK, has proven adept, most of all, at not being held accountable for the things that it's done since 9/11 and the ways that it has treated people in its war on terror, with all the torture and rendition and definite detention without charge or trial and all the abuse. Now, Shaka certainly has knowledge of things that the United States government, and in some cases the British government, would be and are uncomfortable with. When he was seized, it was around the same time as a man called Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, who was the Aamer of an independent training camp in Afghanistan. He was then sent to Egypt, where he was tortured, and where he claimed that there was a connection between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. That Al-Qaeda was trying to get chemical weapons off Saddam Hussein. And if you remember back to the run-up to the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003, You remember that Colin Powell, to his eternal shame, went in front of the United Nations and repeated the lies that Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi had told under torture to justify the invasion of Iraq. And every time that anybody has any knowledge of Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, the United States government gets uncomfortable. Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi was moved around a variety of black sites. He spent a little bit of time in a black site that existed within Guantanamo in the early days, and eventually he was flown back to Libya, which was still ruled by Colonel Gaddafi at that time, and as an opponent of Colonel Gaddafi he was imprisoned, and in the spring of 2009 he died in the notorious Abu Salim prison in Tripoli, allegedly by committing suicide, but nobody was really convinced by that story. Another thing that... what's a black site?
Yeah.
A black site is a secret prison that was run by the CIA. So in the War on Terror, the CIA had black sites in Thailand, in Poland, in Lithuania, and Romania, and also employed other countries to torture prisoners in their own prisons. And that was in Morocco and Syria and Jordan and Egypt. Shaka Aamer also has said that he was very, very badly abused on the same night in June 2006 that 3 men died at Guantanamo. The official story is that these 3 men committed suicide. People who worked at Guantanamo at the time who have spoken about it since suggest that there's no way that this could have happened, that these men were able to do that. So he obviously, you know, has some knowledge of what happened around that time. He also potentially causes problems to the British because shortly after his capture, when he was being very badly abused in a cell in Afghanistan by US forces, he said the British forces were in the room, breaking the cardinal rule of British complicity in torture, which is that if it looks like it's going to take place, you just go out of the room and shut the door. As long as you're outside, it doesn't matter, you weren't in the room. But the British forces, he says, stayed in the room. And so these and other things, Shaka must know about other things. All of the prisoners at Guantanamo who spoke English were able to be a bridge between the prisoners and the authorities. Most of the people, when the prison started, didn't speak English. It must be said that most of them now do speak English, but they haven't learnt it in a very structured, formal manner. They've learnt it through those long years of being in prison. But from at the beginning, the prisoners who spoke English were absolutely the only way that any of the prisoners could communicate with the authorities. And Shaka was the one who, because of his natural leadership abilities, was funneling all kinds of stories between the prisoners and the authorities, and therefore, you know, I think knows a lot about the stories of the individual prisoners. Now, mainly, I think that's interesting, not in the sense that there are huge secrets to be unveiled, but that he will know about the wrongful conditions in which these people were detained and accused. He will know things that we don't know yet about these people that haven't been made public, and I look forward to hopefully being able to help him to get these stories out in one way or another. But Shaka, so Shaka was regarded by some parts of the authorities as a threat. Now, if you look at his file and the classified military files that were released by WikiLeaks in 2011 on most of the prisoners who were held, Shaka's file contains a number of allegations which right-wingers who love to keep Guantanamo open always bring up, which is that he was a member of Al-Qaeda, that he knew Osama bin Laden, and that he was present at the Battle of Tora Bora. And it really doesn't take much detective work to examine these claims and to see that they're completely unreliable. So one of those claims was made by Abu Zubaydah. Abu Zubaydah is the man for whom the Bush administration's torture program was first developed. He was a man who was the gatekeeper of an independent training camp not aligned to Al-Qaeda, the one that Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi that I talked about ran. Abu Zubaydah was captured in March 2002 in a house raid in Pakistan, whisked off to the torture that they were starting to undertake in Thailand. He was ludicrously described as Al-Qaeda's number 3, and even though there were parts of the US intelligence apparatus that knew that he wasn't significant, those people were ignored. They wanted to pretend that he was somebody significant. And it took many years and horrendous torture and abuse of this man before the US authorities actually walked back from all the grandiose claims that they made about him. And now they acknowledge that he wasn't a member of Al-Qaeda. They acknowledge, I believe now, that he didn't even know about the 9/11 attacks. They spent some time trying to work out whether they could prosecute him on the basis that he ran some kind of militia aligned to Al-Qaeda, but we haven't heard much about that for a while. It seems to me that what he primarily did was he helped people out of Afghanistan after the US-led invasion, and that was a whole load of different people. It was soldiers as well as civilians. So Abu Zubaydah is all over those files that were released, and it's quite sad looking at the kind of claims that he makes, because generally he says things like, oh yes, I think that he was maybe perhaps the guy that I saw in a guest house in Kabul, maybe in 1999. You can see it feels like he's clutching at straws while they're doing horrible things to him, which I think is almost entirely true. A couple of other guys who made the other allegations. One of them is a Yemeni who, I don't know exactly under the circumstances in which he made his statements, but he made false statements about a vast number of prisoners at Guantanamo. The most conservative estimate is that 130 prisoners he accused of being at certain places and doing certain things when they didn't. And initially the authorities thought, this guy's a coal mine. And then eventually other parts of the authorities at the prison started to realize that the things that he said were unreliable, and that every time they tried to follow it through, they found out that it was a lie. And another guy who is responsible for these main allegations against Shaka is a man who was held by the Taliban as a spy, but when he was liberated from a prison by the United States, instead of releasing him, they sent him to Guantanamo. They actually did this with 8 men who were held in prisons. One of them was a young Syrian. He had been actually imprisoned as a spy and then tortured. And they found a videotape of the confession that he had made, but because it was in Arabic, they thought it was a suicide bomber video. It was much later that they actually analysed the contents of the video and realised that this was his confession after being tortured by Al-Qaeda. And he also made many false statements, as you might imagine. So there was nothing against Shaka Aamer. There is no case against him. And yet there he sat year after year, and eventually they gave up on the Saudi option, and then it became a matter of, well, how do we get him back to the UK then? The United States' strongest ally in the war on terror. Surely that cannot be difficult to get him back to the UK. And yet, all we ever got in the UK was platitudes of the government about how they were trying to get him back, and it didn't happen. So what happened over a course of many years actually was that a group of people called the Save Shaka Aamer campaign, who I was involved with, but not as relentlessly as they were. I would go down and help them sometimes, but every week they were outside Parliament wearing the orange jumpsuits, reminding our MPs that Shaka Aamer was still in Guantanamo. And they began talking to the most supportive MPs that they could find, and the most supportive MPs that they could find, really, the first one they began with, who was very often the most supportive MP you can find when you've suffered any kind of injustice, is a man called John MacDonald, a long-time ferocious opponent of injustice of all kinds, a backbench scourge of the Tony Blair-style Labour Party, a man who is now the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, because his best mate, Jeremy Corbyn, also a similar scourge of Blairite right-wing Labour, was elected the leader of the Labour Party in summer, in a very, very interesting political development in the UK. There is now a socialist at the head of the Labour Party, and believe me, the right-wingers in the Labour Party are trying to get rid of him, and the establishment is scared. But I slightly digress. Jeremy Corbyn was also somebody who supported the return of Shaka Aamer, but also they managed to, and we managed to persuade MPs across the political spectrum that it was important that Shaka was released. And we got the support of the Daily Mail, which is a generally atrocious newspaper, which I don't recommend to anybody. A nasty right-wing tabloid. But the editors of the Daily Mail, although they're racist, don't like torture and don't like Guantanamo. But their take on this is really the same as a lot of the Conservative MPs, that the rule of law, it is important to adhere to the rule of law. And as far as they were concerned, Shaka Aamer could be a bad man. In fact, this is exactly how the Daily Mail described it. He could be a bad man, but nobody deserves to be treated this way. We have to respect our laws. And so with this broad spectrum of support for the return of Shaka Aamer, we were all campaigning away. And the Daily Mail really began just over a year ago, which was also when I began with a friend called Joanne McInnes, who's an activist, this campaign involving a giant inflatable figure of Shaka Aamer. And this had come about because every 6 months we used to hold these parliamentary meetings where we would get together with John McDonnell primarily and with other supporters and talk about what we could do. And I thought, we're not getting anywhere here. We need something new that's going to happen. And I suggested that what we need was that every time the Conservative ministers and the Prime Minister, everywhere they went, they would be ambushed by a giant figure of Shaka Aamer which would rear up behind them, like the literal elephant in the room. And I said this at this meeting, and Joanne was in the crowd. I didn't know her at that point. She came up afterwards and said, "That sounds like a great idea. I think that might work. Let's go for it." So she paid for it and got it made. And of course, you can't, no more in the UK than here can you actually have a giant inflatable figure rearing up behind the Prime Minister or the President. I think if you didn't get shot, you'd certainly be arrested straight away. But having got the thing made, we then thought, well, how are we going to do this? And it turns out we didn't. If we had a huge network of gung-ho youngsters who were prepared to risk arrest, probably we would have gone for that. Just ambushing ministers wherever they went. But it turned out that actually it was probably more useful for Joanne and I not really to get arrested. But we realised that when we got the most obvious early supporters involved, that they liked the inflatable. I didn't know which way it was going to go. Some people told us it was a really stupid idea. Some people tried to make out that it was really insulting that we came up with this. Other people said, some of the really, really good campaigners, but they said, you can't show his face, you're going to upset Muslim sensibilities, you have to put a hood on his head. It's like, that isn't going to work really. Do you not know that people engage with the face? We went ahead and it turned out that people did really like it. So, I'm glad that it wasn't a failure because it caught on. And we ended up, I don't know, Richie, whether you can scroll a bit on this page just so people can see. Because for now, everybody's been looking for a long time at a Labour MP, a Conservative MP, and my friend Todd Pearce, who used to be a military defence attorney at Guantanamo. There's Medea Benjamin, the code pink. We had loads of MPs, we had a lot of celebrities, and it helped to keep the pressure on. And what eventually happened in May was that a delegation of MPs came over to the US, and with the help of a good friend of mine, Tom Wilner, who's the lawyer who represented the Guantanamo prisoners in their habeas corpus cases in front of the Supreme Court in 2004 and 2008. The MPs met with senators, they met with Dianne Feinstein, they met with John McCain. They raised Shaka's case, and little by little it became more obvious that Shaka's case wasn't going away. On July the 4th, we got an open letter to President Obama printed in The Guardian, and in the last few days before that was printed, we were and people who hadn't been involved before were coming on board. So the last few days, Sting came on board. He'd been asked by a musician friend of his. There are other musicians like Roger Waters who've been on board all the way through. But Sting came on board, then Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, who I generally don't really have a good word to say about, signed up to it at the last minute. And I must admit, I am always going to be pleased that I wrote a letter that Boris Johnson signed, calling for Shaka Aamer's release, that was published in The Guardian. I can't imagine ever writing anything again that Boris would put his name to, but maybe he'll surprise me again. And so, then finally we heard the news in September that Shaka was going to be released. We heard this news, and then we heard from within Guantanamo via one of his indefatigable lawyers, Clive Stafford Smith, the founder of Reprieve, that Shaka was unhappy about the way he was being treated, even though he'd been told he was going home, and had embarked on a hunger strike. So we kind of got a bit freaked out about that and thought, what are we going to do? And then I think really at Clive's suggestion, Clive's very good at throwing out suggestions and seeing if people pick them up. And Joe, who I work with, is very good at picking up suggestions. So the next thing that I knew, we were doing a fast for Shaka. And there's a little poster for it. If you, Richie, go to the other page that says your photos, and scroll down a little bit. Yeah, here we go. We set up a website in a very short amount of time where we asked people to pledge to undertake a fast for Shaka for 24 hours, and loads of people came on board to do it, which was great. I mean, it just kept the pressure on, because you can't really trust these guys running Guantanamo. You can't really trust the president. If they can worm their way out of it, it's quite appropriate to think that they're going to do, especially with Shaka. So we did this, and then Shaka eventually came home on October the 30th. And if you can go back up to the top of this page, Richie. There's me looking rather happy. And that was a photo that Shaka took. His daughter took that of him, and he made it available to supporters just after he came back. I was really pleased to, that's putting it mildly, I was over the moon really to meet Shaka, which was a couple of weeks after his release. And Joe arranged a meeting in the Houses of Parliament, which we had to be very hush-hush about, because they were trying to, they were making the media negotiations for Shaka telling his story at the time, but everybody wanted to meet him, and I think it was incredibly useful for him as well. I think he was aware that a huge number of people had helped him, and he felt really that he didn't know really how to cope with that, and wanted at least to thank people. So I met him outside Parliament, and we went into the room that the Labour Party uses for its cabinet meetings, apparently. And his supporters met him, and the MPs who'd done so much for him came and met him. And he was everything that I thought he was going to be. He is extraordinarily charismatic with this amazing energy, dancing eyes and a totally winning smile, and he does not shut up. And there are two really weird things about the whole thing of them having held him for so long, is that you meet him and you think, how did they not know that they were wrong? How did they not know? Because all Shaka talks about is injustice. And if you've heard him being recorded. He was recorded by a CBS 60 Minutes crew who visited in the fall of 2013 and didn't know that he was there. And they were walking through the corridor and Shaka had figured out that somebody was there and he started shouting about injustice and about letting the world come to the prison and see. And, you know, he did that all the time. I mean, he didn't shut up. And you think they really thought that this guy was somebody so significant because they were unable to understand that the people who told them these things were liars. Just an inability to understand on every level that this man wasn't the threat that they made him out to be. That of course he had leadership abilities because of who he was, and that he organized the prisoners to resist what happened to them. But, you know, as I suspect as in all prisons, if you show this kind of leadership, then they suppress you. And that's the situation in Guantanamo. Is within Guantanamo, their necessity to keep order means that anybody that they can't control, anybody, to be honest, that they can't break, is regarded as a threat. And when I say break, I'm going back to that explanation I gave you of the people who, under one form or another of torture, abuse, bribery, exhaustion, gives up on their resistance and tells them what they want to hear. And, you know, I don't know what you think. I don't know how I would react under those circumstances, but it's difficult, I think, to imagine that you could endlessly resist and not crack. The prisoners who don't, the prisoners who didn't, get locked up in solitary like Shaka did for years because they couldn't break them. And the most extraordinary story about Shaka, which Clive told me from before the hunger strike in 2013. So there was a massive hunger strike in the prison in 2013. That kick-started President Obama's recognition that he had made a promise to close Guantanamo and that he had to do something about it, because after Congress raised these obstacles, he was very, very good at sitting on his hands and saying, there is nothing I can do because of what Congress has done. And the hunger strike in 2013 really focused the indignation of the world on him, and he had to do something about it. But before that, Shaka had been continued waging his battle against the authorities in Guantanamo. And this I think, this explains to me his extraordinary resistance, actually. So he's in isolation because he spent so much time in isolation. And every day they would let him go out to rec, so to the recreation area, where in this open area, but I think it doesn't have any light. It's not a pleasant place, but that's the only time they let him out of the cell. He didn't see anybody, but he was there in the rec area for an hour, maybe 2 hours if they were feeling nice. And then they would say, 239, because they don't call the prisoners by their names, 239, it's time to come back in, and he just sat there. So then when you don't obey in Guantanamo, then they send either the immediate reaction force or the emergency reaction force or extreme reaction force, it's different names. But it's 5 tooled up, armoured guys who come and, you know, beat the crap out of you if you don't do what you're told. And so they did this, and then they, you know, hurt him and dragged him back into his cell. And the next day, he would go out to rec, and they would say at the end of it, 239, it's time to come in. The same thing happened. And he did this for months until they gave up. They gave up. He won. But what a cost of making them give up was that he was prepared to go through that, of letting them beat him up every day until they would go, oh, we can't do this anymore. He won. Just extraordinary. I cannot understand the resilience, to be honest, and I can't understand the energy that he has, the life force that this man has. Now, you know, I wouldn't for a minute say that he's not damaged, because I think you are. You know, even somebody so obviously strong as that is damaged, has to be damaged so considerably, not just physically, but mentally by what he's gone through. He's got to readjust to a family that doesn't know him, you know, which is awful. But I really am just in awe of his resilience and his spirit. And I think that what we should do now is watch just a little bit of Shaka, which was filmed outside the US Embassy on Monday, which was the 14th anniversary of the opening of Guantanamo. And this is, what happened is that Shaka got together with 6 other former prisoners, and they were protesting outside the embassy, and this is something that happened when he was out there.
I haven't seen this man for over 14 years, and you see him crying like a baby. Imagine all these rest of the brothers who sit there waiting for their loved ones. I think they deserve to go home. I want everybody to know that today we are here, not as brother from Guantanamo, no, as everybody, all of you, the media outlets, for one reason, is truly to bring justice back, to close Guantanamo once and for all.
It's been kept open by a country who claim to be, the champions of democracy, champions of justice. It's just a joke, to be honest. And it's sad to me that it's open and I'm out, and I've moved on with life, and they haven't, and they're still stuck there.
There's a 90-minute interview that Shaka did with the BBC, which I urge everyone to look at if you haven't. And I think the other day he did a 30-minute interview with RT. But I think it's fair to say we haven't heard the last of him, because he really can't shut up when he gets started, and he's got a lot to say. But that's very moving, isn't it? In the interest of wearing more than one hat, I was going to play you a song. So if I can just get this in position. I borrowed a guitar. I don't have a strap, so I'm going to have to sit down while I play it. You really need to see me. Just get a chair.
While Andy's setting up, we didn't mention this, but it was 7 years ago that Obama announced he was going to be closing Guantanamo that year. It seems quite obvious that it's still open. So it was open under Bush for 7 years. Then Obama came into office and said, I'm going to close it, and it's now been 7 more years.
It is, isn't it? Yeah, it's the same amount of time. Just a little song then. This is Song for Shaka Aamer, which I wrote, which I've got a band called the Forefathers, and we played it as the campaign video for We Stand With Shaka. So without the band, I'm just going to play a little acoustic version and sing it with the updated lyrics to reflect his release. So here goes. This is a song for Shaka Aamer, the last British man in Guantanamo. Held for nearly 14 years, although for 8 years the US said that he could go. And half the men still held are in the same sad situation. Yeah, they're prisoners of political games that ought to shame the nation. You can join in if you get the chorus. Shackled, shackled, they change your body, but they could not change your mind. You told truth to power, even though you were behind the wire. Shackled, shackled, they change your body, but they cannot change your mind. You told truth to power, even though you were behind the wire. Aamer was no terrorist. In fact, he cared deeply for his fellow man. That's why he took his family to help poor Muslims in Afghanistan. But he was sold to the US for money, and he was held because of all he knew. Yeah, he came to be seen as a leader, cause he stood up to all the torture and abuse. Chorus. Shackled, shackled, they change your body, but they could not change your mind. You told truth to power, even though you were behind the wire. Yeah, shackled, shackled, they change your body, but they could not change your mind. You told truth to power, even though you were behind the wire. So Aamer's back in London, where he'd been granted indefinite leave to remain. Yes, a huge campaign to get him back. Shame the US and the UK, that much is plain. And Shaka's family, they waited so patiently for him to come home. Yeah, he hadn't seen his youngest son, who was born the day he got to Guantanamo. Shackled, shackled, they change your body, but they could not change your mind. You told truth to power, even though you were behind the wire. Shackled, shackled, they change your body, but they could not change your mind. You told truth to power, even though you were behind the wire.